Hey guys, welcome back to another whiteboard chat, and today we're going to talk about leptin. So this was one of the suggestions in a story post, or it might have been a post on my feed that I had made about topics that everyone wanted to see. There were some other good suggestions too, so I'll probably cover some of those in upcoming videos. And leptin is a pretty cool hormone, and I know that it's a term that's thrown around a lot, and when we talk about fat loss, it should be talked about with fat gain as well, and you'll see why. But I wanted to talk about some of the mechanisms that it's responsible in helping to regulate, a little bit about what it does as a hormone, and maybe some other small things that you may not have realized that leptin was responsible for. All right, so first off, leptin is a hormone. It's primarily manufactured in adipose tissue, so which will make sense considering what it does. All right, so let's look at this little web here. Kind of shows what leptin is responsible for, and then also some of what it does. But let's start up here. All right, so lots of things, and there are some other small things, or maybe things that are indirect, but these are some of the ones I wanted to focus on because I think they're the most relevant to us. And first off, blood pressure. Yeah, an increase or decrease in leptin would change blood pressure. I put increase in blood pressure here too in response to leptin. So next, glucose stimulated insulin secretion going down with leptin response, right? Then heart rate going up. I mean, that's kind of coincides with the blood pressure. Regulates bone mass. That's an interesting one. So leptin actually has a direct effect on anabolism within bone mass. All right, so, and there's a couple potential mechanisms there. I'm not super researched in that specific category, but I do know that it does have a direct anabolic effect on bone mass. Excuse me. All right, so kind of cool. Leptin it is a regulatory hormone, and that's what it does. So that's an interesting one. Now, immune cell activation, yes, that's again another one that's not really related to fat loss and fat gain, but you can see how immune cell activation fits in there, because leptin's whole goal is as a regulatory hormone that regulates your well-being as in general. It's such a cool hormone because it's regulating so many functions that are related to homeostasis within your body. All right, it's not just energy systems, it's also bone mass, it's also immune cells, right? All right, appetite and energy homeostasis. Well, yeah, that's kind of what I just mentioned. Its goal is to go up and down in response to how much fat you have, how much you're eating. It's trying to balance those things out. Regulating menstrual cycle, MC being menstrual cycle. And that's an interesting one too, because you think of, well, what happens in females when they go too low calorie, or they lose too much body fat, or they get too stressed out, or what are some of the consequences? Well, loss of menstrual cycle or amenorrhea. So is leptin responsible for this? In part, yes, it is. So in response to leptin levels dropping too much, could be a secondary consequence. All right, so leptin actually as part of loss of menstrual cycle. So that's an interesting one. Regulating thyroid function. Yeah, I mean, leptin does have a part in thyroid function, or thyroid regulation, I guess you should say, which again makes sense considering its main goal as a homeostatic hormone and energy balance homeostasis. All right, so let's move down and talk about kind of some of the ins and outs and what it does and how it works. Well, we talked about what it does, but let's look here. Fat loss, real simple terms. Fat loss, leptin goes down typically. Fat gain, leptin goes up. That's part of what we see in metabolic adaptation. That's part of why we want to do things like refeeding, right? And this isn't just fat loss, this is also in regards to eating. So if we look over here, after eating, leptin increases and appetite decreases. Well, it's going to be the opposite. During long periods of not eating, leptin will decrease to some extent, and appetite will usually increase. And you can also add in ghrelin hormone in there, right? We know that that's a large regulator of appetite, and these two hormones work together. But you can see what's going to happen as a hormone responsible for any energy homeostasis, and if you don't eat for a long time and you lose too much body fat, that it's going to go down. Makes sense. Easy enough, right? So that's why, like I said, we're doing things like refeeding. That's how that kind of came about. A lot of what that does is help regulate leptin levels, and we know that now, especially since we have more research and people have more experience with refeeding, that it might take extended periods of time. So not only do we have refeeding, but we have things like diet breaks now where people are doing longer, even longer periods of time out of a deficit to help reset leptin levels. And also some downregulation of thyroid, though that downregulation of thyroid's based on the research seems to be not a ton. There is some for sure. It probably varies person to person, obviously, like anything else, but leptin levels can certainly vary. So they can test serum leptin levels in different situations. And, you know, if you jump on Google or PubMed or whatever and you go and look, and there is research on serum leptin levels and starvation and fat loss, and you'll see that stuff. You'll see that research out there. All right. Now, so a couple other kind of subtopics, or well, you'll see this here. I think this is cool to point out. So brain interpretation changes behavior. And what I mean by that is brain's interpretation of the situation changes behavior. So leptin also connected with change in behavior. So what do I mean by that? I'm talking about things like lower energy output. So not only is it actually helping with metabolic function, but also your energy output. So I've talked about, and you hear other people talk about, well, your NEAT levels go down. Like maybe kind of unconsciously you're moving less. Part of that's because you're tired, but part of that's also because your body wants you to move less. It's trying to get you to move less unconsciously. It's making you more efficient at things in order to burn less calories. So that's all kind of intentional, and leptin is involved in this homeostatic process. It's part of that, right? Brain interprets the situation, and based on leptin levels, and you will move less or become more efficient at things. You know, you might take the way that you walk might change, the way that you pick things up and move and do things might change. Is it a massive difference? Probably not. It's subtle, but it accumulates over time, and then that can, lower energy expenditure, right? Not only that, but becoming, I use a word like cardio adapted, right? Becoming more adapted to your movement, and the amount of calories that you actually burn doing something that's the same as before might become less, if that makes sense. All right, and leptin resistance and obesity. So there's a lot of research on this. The problem is it doesn't seem like there's a ton of solution. So we were actually talking about this on the OPD podcast last week. We were talking about refeeding, and this will probably be out before that comes out. But if you are interested in this, I would tune in and listen. We talked about how leptin, how it would actually be used in a clinical setting at exogenous leptin, like injecting people with exogenous leptin, perhaps. Now, do we really see that in practice? Like, for example, do we go into the doctor and you're overweight? Do they prescribe you leptin? No. Would it work if they did? Maybe. Now, leptin resistance can happen for a few reasons. It can happen partially as a self-induced thing where, you know, you've disrupted this regulatory system so much by being out of energy, you know, way off on your energy balance for a long period of time. Okay, so do we see, let's apply this to our population. So do you think that we see that in over dieting or yo-yo dieting, or people that never spend long periods of time in a deficit and then seemingly cannot lose weight later on down the line? Probably yes. There's probably some disruption there. Now, leptin resistance is not only a signaling issue, but also a receptor issue, which I'll talk about in a second with PCOS. So not only a signaling issue in how it's, you know, signaling based on body fat and food consumption, but also an issue at the receptor site where the leptin's actually utilized. So yeah, leptin resistance and obesity are certainly an issue. It's difficult to test, probably because leptin moves around a lot. And I mean, leptin's even throughout a single day is going to move a lot. All right, so I don't know if that's maybe a future, a potential treatment option in the future that you would see pop up in a therapeutic, you know, in a therapeutic setting. How it would necessarily be regulated or monitored, even, because I feel like it would. I feel like doing too much of it, you could potentially just starve yourself to death. I mean, you would be tired still, but you would not have appetite, and you could just basically not eat and still have leptin. So maybe dangerous, perhaps. All right, so look down here. Yeah, I mentioned leptin resistance and metabolic adaptations. Yeah, I mean, part of that, the metabolic adaptations, we use that word as kind of a that term is kind of an all-encompassing term. Yeah, part of that is leptin. Part of it's thyroid function. I mean, depending on how you want to define it, I would even say part of it is the whole cardio adaptation and movement efficiency and all that. So yes, leptin is probably the primary player in the whole idea of metabolic adaptation. You see, I've seen all kinds of different opinions on how much that actually happens. I've seen, you know, and leptin obviously plays into BMR, right? I've seen numbers thrown out like a maximum of 10% in change in BMR with metabolic adaptation, and then if you look at some people, they end up with like massive, what should be a massive energy deficit. Like, take myself, what should be a massive energy deficit in my prep doesn't even end up that way. Well, there's a couple reasons. My body weight's lower, so I'm burning less because I'm carrying less weight. I should probably have some large amount of adaptation. Okay, well then you could say some people have lower NEAT levels, so even if I match my NEAT levels, you know, I should be able to match all of those things, right? I could wear a weighted vest around if I wanted to equal the weight. So I don't know that I necessarily agree with the whole like 10% thing. I think that it can definitely be more based on the person. And, you know, the models for these studies, like, are they using people that are like super low body fat, extreme level, like contest bodybuilder? Probably not in most cases. So take those numbers for what you will. But yeah, leptin's absolutely probably the primary driver in the whole metabolic adaptation thing. And then I added PCOS on here just because we like to talk about female hormones. And in females, so just between males and females, I would be interested to look at the data, but I'm sure there's probably a gender-driven difference in metabolic adaptation. Well, I know that, I mean, in anecdotally, at least seeing it, I've seen that there is, but I would be curious to see if there's like a statistic on that through the research. I haven't looked at it because I see it all the time, so it's not really something I've actively looked for. But like what the difference is in leptin response in males and females and how quickly it adapts, right? Now I put PCOS on here too because that adds, PCOS is an interesting one because you see that they typically have a more difficult time losing body fat, and they, at least in my experience with working with females that have PCOS, they're also a lot quicker to adapt, right? They have at least more extreme adaptations. It happens faster, and they have a more difficult time. So why is that? Well, is part of it the whole insulin resistance bit? Maybe it could be. Part of it could be that their bodies tend to get stressed out more, so they have that progesterone steal or cortisol steal or whatever you want to call it, and end up with some estrogen dominance. So those things, yeah. But I'm talking about, and these things make sense, right? But if we're talking about purely energy balance, then why is that adaptation occurring? We're talking about calories in and calories out. Well, there's actually some research on this, or some literature on this, talking about leptin resistance in females with PCOS. So what is happening? Well, from what I've seen, and this confused me at first because, years ago I was looking this up because I was starting to run into these women with PCOS, and I didn't understand why they had, such an extreme adaptation. And then I started noticing that they had higher leptin levels in a lot of the research. Well, that doesn't make much sense. So if we look at higher serum leptin levels, does that necessarily mean that it's acting the way it should at the receptor site? And the answer is no. All right. So what is potentially happening, based on what I've read and what I understand, is that they may have leptin resistance at the receptor site. So less actual receptors and also less receptor activity. So they essentially just aren't using leptin or utilizing leptin the way that they should be, and that's why they would have quote unquote leptin resistance. And because we think of the word resistance, well, you can think of like insulin resistance, right? That doesn't mean that you have low insulin levels. It just means that you're not utilizing it as efficiently as you could. So that's kind of why I wanted to throw that in there, because people are always curious why the heck that happens. Fixing it and working around that's a whole different story. It just takes more strategic approach and being cyclical and using refeeding and diet breaks and not over dieting and not staying in deficits too much, not yo-yo dieting, blah, blah, blah. All the stuff that you'd normally do, just amplified, and sometimes to a pretty extreme extent depending on the person. So that's leptin. Those are some of the things that it does, at least some of the ones that you guys might be interested in. That's how it works in kind of the push-pull fashion with food intake and body fat and all that. A little bit about leptin resistance. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I will go back and check my story, kind of see what else people suggested. I think there are some other good topics, and we'll cover those next time.